Star Trek has had a rich and vibrant history, but what's always surprised me is how little each individual Trek fan knows of its history, either knowing little tidbits and pieces through trivia, or believing myths that have cropped up that have no basis in reality. The Trek fan base deserves a comprehensive retelling of how each of the Star Trek series and movies came to be, and in this series, I'll endeavor to do that. Hello and welcome to Backtrek, a web series that focuses on the background information of any given topic in Star Trek. In today's episode, we're taking a look at how Star Trek the original series came to be and the behind-the-scenes drama that would ultimately lead to its downfall. Please note, having originally done this video as a multi-part series on this channel in its very early days, I thought I'd go back, re-record, and re-edit this video with some awesome updates I've learned since I originally made it. But for any story to make it into this video, I had one requirement, that it be confirmed by 3 separate sources connected to the show itself. Sources include all the autobiographies of the Star Trek the original series actors, interviews of the cast and crew of Star Trek, as well as things such as memos and journal entries, just to name a few of those sources. So, as you can imagine, it was a lot of work putting this video together. Anyhow, sit back, relax, and put your pointy ears on, and I hope you enjoy the video. So, where did it all begin? Well, most people think it began with Gene Roddenberry giving over his proposal for Star Trek to the powers that be, but that's not entirely true. It actually starts with Lucille Ball, America's favorite comedian redhead. After her divorce from Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball decided to buy out Desi's shares of their mutually owned studio named Desilu. But through a series of bad business decisions, the studio was left with only one show to produce, and that was The Lucy Show. I Love Lucy had ended years beforehand, and The Lucy Show was Lucille Ball's new comedy that focused on her as the central character. A very different type of show, it retained the similar antics that the I Love Lucy show was famous for, but unfortunately it was not enough to keep Desilu afloat on its own. Becoming desperate for new series to produce and to make money off of, Herb Solow, vice president of Desilu, began to put out feelers for new series ideas. And with that, in April 1964, Gene Roddenberry showed up at Herb Solow's office and pitched a show called Star Trek. As Solow recalls,
"My first impression was that this tall, unkempt person recently learned how to dress himself but hadn't quite gotten the knack. His gait reminded me of tepid water flowing from a slow faucet, and his hair unidirectionally flopped over his eyes like a very shaggy dog's."
By the end of the meeting, however, Gene had cemented Star Trek as a possible show idea for Desilu to produce. Gene Roddenberry himself was a prolific writer, having written the most scripts for a series known as Half Gun Will Travel. He even sold a series idea he created called The Lieutenant. That series only lasted 1 season, but through it, Roddenberry made many of the connections to the stars that would bring Star Trek to life. So with the idea ready to go, and just begging to be a full-color show, Solow and Roddenberry would head to the networks to try and get a pilot order. CBS was first on the list, and they seemed really enthused about the idea, asking so many questions as though they were ready to commit to the deal of the century. But this was not actually the case. You see, CBS was producing a series called Lost in Space, and were asking so many questions to see how much of a threat to their program this Star Trek series would be. Add to that any production tidbits to lower the costs of their own series, and you can see why CBS jumped at the chance to hear Roddenberry's pitch and keep him engaged. It was something Roddenberry never forgave them for. Then, in May of 1964, Solow and Roddenberry headed over to NBC for their meeting. In order to stack the cards in their favor this time, however, Solow told Gene that during the meeting he should present himself as strange and exotic. This plan was made to lead the NBC execs to believe that Roddenberry must know how to make a science fiction series. After all, look at how odd he is. Though at first not convinced, NBC realizing how big of a gamble Star Trek really was, and not believing a declining studio like Desilu could make the series happen, they finally relented to Solo's urgings, and a pilot order was made. There were some conditions, however. First, Roddenberry would submit 3 story proposals, and from that, the pilot would be filmed. NBC loved all 3 story ideas, but out of those 3 story treatments, NBC would eventually choose one called The Cage. Though Gene had written a great deal about the Starship Enterprise, then named the USS Yorktown, somehow he was just not able to visualize what the ship actually looked like. So to solve this problem, set designer Matt Jeffries was given the task to flesh out the great starship into reality. Giving a list to Jeffries about what the Starship Enterprise shouldn't look like, such as flying saucers or rockets, Jeffries accepted the challenge, making hundreds of sketches, plastering his office walls with all of them. Roddenberry would then come in, look at each individual picture, and tell Jeffries if he liked anything within those pictures. Any picture that received no comment would be thrown into the trash, and any receiving a compliment, Jeffries would place aside and noted what elements Gene liked. Eventually, through combining piece by piece of all of these drawings, Jeffries believed he had the Enterprise design figured out. But just to be sure, he actually made a full-color painting of the ship, and when Roddenberry saw it, the design was finalized. In fact, Gene loved the painting of the Enterprise so much that Jeffries ended up giving it to him as a gift. With the Howard Anderson Company hired to create the ship's special effects, the next step was to create the model of the ship, which was now called the USS Enterprise. The first model was 4 to 5 inches long and made of wood and cardboard. When that was approved by Roddenberry, then they created a 3-foot model of the starship. This model would be used for the fast or further away shots of the Enterprise. Then finally, the oxymoron was created, the big miniature. At approximately 11 feet in length, this ship was heavy and bulky, but would be used for the detailed close-ups of the Enterprise when needed. Contrary to popular belief, however, when you see the Enterprise moving on screen, it's actually doing nothing of the sort. Movement of the ship was achieved by the camera moving towards and around the model that had been placed in front of a blue screen. Later, during post-production, the blue screen would be removed, replaced with a starry background, and the Enterprise would appear to be zooming into your living room. All during this time, Roddenberry set to work on writing the script for The Cage. So serious about it was Roddenberry that he actually reached out to the scientific community in order to ensure his script was accurate and believable. A physicist named Harvey P. Lynn would make many of the contributions that would solidify Star Trek in the scientific community. For example, in Roddenberry's original draft, Lynn noted that the names of the star systems used made no sense, chosen simply because they would sound familiar to the audience. He told Roddenberry that if any scientist with half a mind were to watch his show and attempt to plot the course of the Enterprise, very quickly they would realize that it was zigzagging wildly across the galaxy, and that just wouldn't make any sense. So Roddenberry took his advice and used it, and that became a staple in Star Trek. One of the major things Roddenberry was set on was the inclusion of an alien character. This character would allow the audience to immediately recognize that this was indeed the future, and the character would also provide an outlet for the writers to explore humanity through. And of course, this character would come to be known as Spock. When the character began to take shape in Gene's mind, he immediately knew who he wanted to play that role. That was, of course, Leonard Nimoy. Nimoy had worked with Gene on the failed Lieutenant series, and with his angular, prominent features, made it much easier to make Nimoy appear alien. And although other actors would test for the role, Nimoy would ultimately win out. And so, with Nimoy on board, he immediately began to receive grief from NBC. They were worried that 1960s suburban America would not receive such a character very well. In fact, when NBC put out a brochure about the upcoming show, they even went as far as to airbrush out Mr. Spock's pointed ears and angular eyebrows. But Roddenberry stood his ground, as he would come to do over and over again. And eventually, NBC relented, allowing Gene to keep the alien, albeit in a reduced capacity on the show. Roddenberry approached Lloyd Bridges to play Captain Christopher Pike. Bridges, however, made it clear he wasn't interested in doing a science fiction series. So Roddenberry then approached Jeffrey Hunter, who was subsequently hired to play the good captain. And Majel Barrett, who was actually Gene Roddenberry's mistress, was hired on to play the female first officer number 1, something NBC was not impressed about. As Solo recalls,
since Gene couldn't be moved relative to this little-known actress and met with NBC to try to sell the notion, NBC program executive Jerry Stanley stared quizzically at NBC Vice President Grant Tinker. Then Jerry grumbled, "Christ, Herb, this is madness. She's his girlfriend. I remember her hanging around Gene's office at MGM when he was doing the lieutenant for us." The simple truth is that NBC resented being put into such an awkward position.
Roddenberry himself would create the myth about the female first officer after the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, had been commissioned.
In varying degrees, we're not too happy with some of the cast. While we support the concept of a woman in a strong leading role, we have serious doubts as to Majel Barrett's abilities to carry the show as its co-star.
And so, to save the feelings of the woman he loved, he made up a story about not being allowed to have a female first officer, and the myth was born. Robert Bob Justman and William Ware Tice would beam on board the Starship Enterprise. Justman was the associate producer of Star Trek. Ultimately, he would oftentimes solve any of the problems that the Enterprise was having in production. And Tice would create all the costumes and uniforms that would bring the Enterprise crew to life. That included the Starfleet Delta, that would become one of the most recognized symbols of the Star Trek franchise. Almost as iconic as the Delta is Alexander Sandy Courage's main theme for Star Trek. But Courage would also go on to create the planetary background music, which gave depth to each alien planet visited, and then he himself would whoosh sounds into a microphone, and that would become the sound the Enterprise made when it traveled past the screen during warp flight. On December 12, 1964, filming began on the Cage. Filming lasted 12 days, and with budget overruns, would cost approximately $680,000 to make. That's just over $5.5 million in today's money. But everyone working on and around the show truly believed that they had created something very special, and so these overruns were basically ignored. Interesting problems plagued Star Trek's technical side, however. For example, no one had ever filmed a green alien woman for television before. So when Vina was to be filmed as an Orion slave girl, they needed to figure out how exactly to accomplish this feat. Roping Majel Barrett into the screen tests, she was painted up by makeup artist Freddie Phillips, and all seemed right with the world. However, when the daily screen tests came back from the lab, everyone was horrified, not because Majel didn't look good, but because she wasn't green at all, having normal screen tones. Roddenberry demanded a new set of screen tests, and Phillips created a new batch of greener makeup. But again, the dailies showed this actress to have normal skin tones, and Roddenberry angrily sent Phillips back to his trailer to create an even greener and thicker makeup batch to test again. Once again, an actress was plastered with the gunk and test footage was filmed. But once again, the dailies came back with normal, lovely skin tones on the actress. Finally, Roddenberry called the film lab to ask for any tricks that they could use to make this alien appear green. The lab responded, "You want her green? I've spent the past 3 nights working overtime to correct your actress's lousy green skin tones. I just thought you had a horrible cinematographer." Roddenberry just laughed, and from then on, alien skin tones were reported to the lab along with the day's film. Once the cage was edited together, the final print was airmailed to NBC in New York, and after the powers that be screened the pilot, they were unanimously convinced of two things. First, that the cage was one of the most amazing and beautiful works of art ever created for television, and second, that it stunk as a series pilot, and so they passed on the project. You see, NBC felt that Star Trek as it was too cerebral for American television, that it didn't have enough action or adventure for the American audience at large. They just simply wouldn't understand it at all. Add to that their intense dislike about Majel's #1 character, and their complete loathing of the Spock character made their decision even easier. In fact, during test screenings of the pilot, Majel's character was universally disliked by men and women, as they found her too condescending and too pushy for their likes. And so, Star Trek was dead, and the project would not be moving forward. But after a few more viewings of the cage, NBC reversed their decision. Sort of. They made the move to give Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry one more shot, and commissioned a second pilot. And this pilot, entitled Where No Man Has Gone Before, would become the reason the multi-billion-dollar franchise of Star Trek exists today. NBC was taking no chances this time, promising to keep an even closer eye on this pilot's production. Also, they had a few stipulations to which Roddenberry had to agree to, or the new pilot simply wouldn't be made. First on their list was character changes. Proven right, at least in their own mind, about Majel Barrett not being able to carry a series as a lead position, they demanded she get the chop. Roddenberry was not happy about this, and began to argue for keeping her when the network execs also insisted that the Spock character be axed as well. Gene had a huge love for that character, and felt it was a necessary component to the show. We as an audience, he felt, could reevaluate humanity through the eyes of this Vulcan. And so, briefly giving it some thought, weighing his options, he deduced that he could probably save one character in a compromise, but not both. And so he chose to keep the Spock character and axe his mistress, and he was successful in the compromise. Actually, NBC hated almost all the characters in the first pilot, that is, except for the captain. Jeffrey Hunter was approached to reprise his role as Captain Christopher Pike in the second pilot, and a few days later, his wife showed up at the studio. Taking her into a screening room, she viewed the original pilot and then afterwards said, "My Jeffrey is a movie star, not a television actor," and walked out. Gene did not like Hunter's wife one bit. She was a very demanding woman. In fact, many times during the production of The Cage, she would barge into Gene's office and make demands like, "My Jeffrey can't be filmed from this angle anymore," or "He has to eat this type of food today." With that, Gene decided not even to pursue Hunter, as he felt that Hunter's wife would end up driving him mad. Another stipulation NBC had was that the filming budget would not be allowed to go over $300,000, and the filming of this episode was to take place primarily on the sets already built for the first pilot, as they would not be giving any money for any new elaborate sets to be constructed. And once again, Roddenberry was to submit 3 scripts, and NBC would decide which one would become the second pilot. So with these restrictions in place, Roddenberry set to work on reinventing his Star Trek baby. First, with such a small window before the network expected filming to begin, there wasn't enough time for Gene to write all 3 scripts, something which he wasn't happy about. So Herb Solow enlisted the aid of writers Steve Kandel and Sam Peoples. Gene would go on to write his story called The Omega Glory, while Kandel would write a story that he called Mudd's Women. At first excited about his involvement in Star Trek, Kandel's view of the series quickly soured when Roddenberry added his name as story creator to the script, something Kandel never forgot or forgave. The final script, written by Peoples, which he called Where No Man Has Gone Before, was an exciting tale which showcased all the best elements and staples that Star Trek would become known for, And as we all know, when the cards were laid on the table, people's script was the one that was chosen to be the new pilot. Roddenberry then proceeded to flesh out all the new characters aboard the ship. One of the first to be hired was to be the chief engineer, Montgomery Scott. James Goldstone, the director of the second pilot, approached James Doohan, who readily agreed to the part. Originally, the chief helmsman was to be another actor, with the name Sulu being reserved for the communications officer, who was to be a male person of color. Of course, this would all change as to everyone Sulu sounded more Japanese, and Sulu also sounded too close to Zulu for anyone's liking. George Takei would actually be hired to play the Enterprise's biophysicist. He wouldn't become the helmsman until the series was actually picked up by the network. Of course, Sulu's changing career would spark many debates in canon circles. Gary Lockwood would come on board as the ship's navigator and main villain for this episode. Sally Kellerman would play the ship's psychologist opposite Lockwood. Paul Fix would play Dr. Mark Piper. And finally, William Shatner would be beamed on board as series lead, Captain James R. Kirk. Later, of course, to be changed to James T. Kirk, as it rolled off the tongue much easier. Shatner wasn't the first choice, though, for the captain of the Enterprise. Gene actually approached Jack Lord to be the esteemed captain, but Lord turned down the role after Gene refused to give in to his demand for 50% ownership of the show. Second on Gene's list was Shatner, and once he auditioned for the role, Roddenberry immediately snatched him up, as Shatner represented everything he saw in his imagination for Captain Kirk. With all the actors in place, it was time to find a cameraman to film the pilot. Unfortunately, none were available. This was not good news for Gene, Desilu, or NBC. In order to keep production on track, they had to find a cameraman stat. Justman, discussing the issue with director James Goldstone, was informed of an old guy that Goldstone knew that might be interested in filming the pilot. Desperate, Justman agreed and set up an interview between Roddenberry, Solo himself, and this old-timer.
A graying-haired man named Ernest Haller showed up in my office. Gene and Herb sat in on the interview. Haller seemed nice, but I knew nothing about him. I was getting worried. After the usual amenities, Herb broke the ice. "Ernie, could you tell us what you've done recently?" Haller took a long time to respond. "Not much. I've been sort of semi-retired." "Sort of semi-retired?" I asked. Now I was very worried. Herb was persistent. "Well, Ernie, have you done anything that, we might have heard of?" "Well, yes. I did do a picture you might have heard of. It was called Gone with the Wind," he said.
2 minutes later, Ernest was hired on to film the second pilot. So on Monday, July 19th, 1965, filming began on Where No Man Has Gone Before, and it immediately ran into problems. Desilu was an older studio, with very few productions being filmed in any of its lots. In fact, some had laid abandoned so long, various animals and insects had made their homes in their rafters. Well, as filming went on, a low buzzing noise steadily getting louder and louder could be heard. It seemed a colony of wasps had taken refuge in those rafters, and the extremely hot lights above had begun to agitate them. Then all of a sudden, the entire swarm descended onto the stage, stinging everyone in sight, including Shatner, who got a particularly nasty sting under his eye. Well, exterminators were called in almost immediately, but filming had to be stopped due to Shatner's eye puffing up like a baseball. The next day, when Shatner returned for filming, his eye was still swollen. And as a result, in some of the filmed scenes, you can see the legacy left behind by these buzzing little troublemakers. During the battle scene between Lockwood and Shatner, Lockwood had to roll around and land near Kellerman's feet. Well, the scene was going perfectly. Shatner punched, Lockwood rolled, and in fact ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. Unfortunately, because his pants were quite tight, when he landed in front of the actress, his pants decided to give way and completely split. To add insult to injury, it quickly became apparent that Lockwood wasn't wearing any undergarments. So here Lockwood was, laying at Kellerman's feet, phaser drawn as it were, And without missing a beat, Lockwood looks at Kellerman and says, "Smile, you've just had your picture taken." To which Kellerman, also not missing a beat, replied, "What, with that little brownie?" Everyone broke out in laughter. That is, of course, except for Lockwood, who turned a shade of red that would make any dying security officer proud. Another interesting tidbit and problem for Star Trek was that the script for the second pilot called for Lockwood and Kellerman to have silver eyes. Whereas today, you could CGI anything you wanted into a person's eyeballs, back in the 1960s, everything had to be done physically. This meant Lockwood and Kellerman needed special contacts. John Roberts was hired on to make the silver monstrosities, and although he was very dubious to the results, when Justman showed up at his lab, he had already made a working pair for him. In order to make the eyes silver, he had to use tinfoil and laminate on a regular contact lens. Justman was impressed, but immediately noticed a problem.
Tell me, how are the actors going to see through them? See through them? You didn't say anything about seeing through them, he growled.
They were solid silver, so to solve this problem, Roberts made a hole in the center of the tinfoil. Well, when the silver eye scenes began filming, it was quickly apparent that these eyes had a few problems. One was that they were very irritating for the actor to wear. In fact, Lockwood and Kellerman had to remove the contacts many times during filming just to give their eyes a rest. The second problem was that though the actors could now see through the contacts, their field of vision was quite limited. As a result, in order to see who they were talking to, they had to tilt their head at peculiar angles. In the end, of course, this worked to the show's advantage, as it gave an alien godlike condescension to the characters themselves. The second pilot was shot in only 9 days. Though filming was complete on the pilot, there would actually be a significant amount of downtime before the show got pasted together into the finished product. This was because Roddenberry was also working on 2 other pilots for 2 other shows at Desilu. Of course, neither of those shows were picked up, and by American Thanksgiving, Gene was back full-time on Star Trek, furiously editing together the episode. And by the beginning of 1966, the pilot was complete, and once again airmailed to NBC execs, who this time absolutely loved almost everything about the pilot. It was an action-adventure tale so easy to get into, a true wagon train to the stars. Within weeks, NBC had given Star Trek the go-ahead and placed it on its fall schedule. With that deadline in place, Roddenberry, Solo, and Justman began the enormous task of bringing a weekly television series like Star Trek to life, and again there would be problems. And with Star Trek being added to NBC's fall schedule, Gene Roddenberry had very little time to get the whole mess sorted out and running smoothly. But that's another story. Thank you for watching today's episode of Backtrek. What do you think of Star Trek the original series and all the great little tidbits of information I've provided you here in this video? Do you want to see more videos like this one? Well, leave your comments in the section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help the channel continue to show its love of Trek through videos like this one? Then consider becoming a channel member subscriber or a channel patron. Both a major help that allows this channel to purchase resources and 3D models to keep it going. The link to both memberships is in the description below. Thanks again for watching, live long, and prosper.